The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the young teenager, Ethan Harris, stood at the defendant's table. At just 16 years old, he was about to make a statement that no one had anticipated. The case had been a whirlwind from the start. Accusations of a high-profile altercation involving a local politician and a police officer had stirred up both public opinion and media frenzy. But Ethan, a kid who hadn't even graduated from high school, had somehow caught the attention of the legal community. He wasn't the typical defendant. He didn't fit any of the preconceived stereotypes people might have had about someone involved in such a case. Instead, Ethan had spent the last few weeks preparing for his time in court, learning from old legal dramas and reading through complex legal texts in an effort to defend his friend, who was the main accused. As the judge looked over the courtroom, taking in the well-dressed lawyers and the community members seated in the public gallery, he glanced at the teenager who appeared unshaken, a small smirk crossing his face. It was clear from the start that Ethan wasn't there to merely stand by in silence. The prosecution had laid out their argument with typical rhetoric, pushing hard on the idea that the incident had escalated due to personal differences, inflamed by cultural misunderstandings. But when Ethan stood to present his rebuttal, no one knew what to expect. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Ethan began, his voice steady and clear, "I've listened closely to everything that's been said today. And with all due respect, I believe you're looking at the wrong angle." A murmur ran through the crowd. His words had a sharp edge, a sense of quiet confidence that caught everyone off guard. He continued, "You've heard a lot of accusations, a lot of blame thrown around, but none of it addresses the core issue. We're so focused on blaming each other, but we've forgotten something critical. We're all part of the same community, sharing the same values and goals. If we continue to look at this incident through a narrow lens, we're all going to miss something important." The judge's brow furrowed as he waited for Ethan to explain further. The defense attorney, who had been watching from his seat, suddenly became more alert. Ethan paused, allowing his words to settle in the room. "I want to bring attention to the idea that we've let our differences divide us, not just between individuals but also between groups. It's not just about the clash between two people, it's about the misunderstanding and distrust that can build when people begin to see each other as other rather than as equals." There was an awkward silence. The jury exchanged confused glances, unsure of where Ethan was going with this. The prosecution stood, clearly ready to tear down this argument, but the judge signaled for them to remain silent. Ethan wasn't done yet. "Let's shift the conversation," Ethan continued, "away from assigning blame and instead focus on something that actually matters. How do we begin to repair what has been broken?" The courtroom held its breath, and for a moment, even the prosecution seemed unsure of how to respond to such an unexpected challenge. It was the start of something no one could have predicted, and the impact of Ethan's words would reverberate long after the trial was over. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecution, having regained their composure, rose to respond, but Ethan's words had already planted a seed of doubt. The prosecutor, a seasoned lawyer named Rachel Michaels, had dealt with countless cases over her career, yet she found herself struggling with how to approach this teenager's unorthodox defense. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cold and professional, "while I admire the youthful idealism of the defendant, the reality is this case isn't about some philosophical debate. This is about an incident, a clear violation of the law, where the actions of one party escalated the situation. The evidence is clear, and emotions were running high. We can't ignore that." Ethan, however, remained unmoved. He met Rachel's gaze with unwavering determination. His counterpoint, though unconventional, was rapidly gaining traction. The judge, who had initially raised an eyebrow at the teenager's audacity, now appeared intrigued. He leaned forward, giving Ethan an unspoken invitation to continue. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice growing even more steady. "I understand that you're focusing on what happened in the heat of the moment, but let's step back. Is the goal of this trial to punish someone, or is it to understand why things went so wrong in the first place?" The crowd was still. No one had expected such a pointed question from a teenager. It wasn't the sort of thing you'd typically hear in a courtroom, especially not from someone still in high school. The defense attorney, a middle-aged man named Thomas Carter, now stood up to support Ethan. "Your Honor, if I may," Carter interjected, "I believe what Mr. Harris is pointing out is that we are missing a crucial aspect of this entire case, the environment in which these actions occurred." Ethan nodded, continuing. "This isn't just about one officer and one citizen. It's about the entire atmosphere of mistrust, of constant division between us. It's about the kind of environment where each action, each word spoken, is seen through the lens of us versus them. This case didn't start the day of the incident, it started long before, with a pattern of misunderstanding and hostility that we need to address. And if we don't recognize that, then we're only treating the symptoms, not the cause." The courtroom was now alive with murmurs. A few jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Some nodded, as if beginning to understand the depth of what Ethan was saying. The judge's face softened, though he remained neutral. Rachel Michaels tried to maintain control. "With all due respect, Mr. Harris, this is a criminal trial. We deal with facts and evidence, not abstract concepts. The law is the law, and it doesn't bend to philosophical discussions about societal issues." Ethan didn't flinch. "I disagree. The law isn't just about the letter of the law, it's about justice. And justice isn't served by simply assigning blame. It's about understanding the forces that bring us to this point. The real question here isn't whether or not someone made a mistake. It's why that mistake was made in the first place." A few jurors began nodding more vigorously now, some appearing deep in thought. The tension between the prosecution and the defense was palpable, but Ethan's argument had shifted the focus from a narrow legal perspective to a broader, more profound question about society. The judge, visibly moved by the points being raised, sat back in his chair. He tapped his pen thoughtfully against the desk, weighing the weight of Ethan's argument. In a courtroom where the rules of the game were often rigid and predictable, Ethan had shaken things up. His insights were raw, real, and deeply human, a perspective that no one had anticipated from a teenager. At this point, the prosecutor was momentarily speechless. It wasn't that she lacked the skills to argue back, but rather that the nature of Ethan's challenge had struck at something deeper, something that transcended the case at hand. Ethan looked around the room, his eyes locking onto the jury. "I'm not asking for leniency," he said quietly. "I'm asking for understanding. Understanding of the conditions that led us here. If we don't change that, we're just going to keep repeating the same mistakes, over and over again." There was a moment of silence that hung in the air like a heavy fog. The jury was no longer looking at him as a mere teenager but as someone who had offered them something far more valuable than legal jargon, a new way of thinking about the world. As Ethan sat down, a calm settled over the courtroom. The stakes had just been raised to a level no one had expected. The defense, for the first time in this trial, had taken the offensive, and it was working. The battle was far from over, but one thing was certain: Ethan Harris had stunned everyone with a legal take no one saw coming. And as the jury deliberated over the evidence, they now had something far more significant to consider: how to seek justice, not just for the individuals in the case, but for the society that had created this tension in the first place. The morning following Ethan's argument, the courtroom was abuzz. There was a palpable sense of uncertainty in the air, as if something had changed overnight. The prosecutor, Rachel Michaels, had spent hours reviewing the trial's proceedings, trying to find a way to counter Ethan's unexpected move. Despite her expertise, she found herself at a loss. How do you argue against a message so simple, yet so profound? As the trial resumed, the judge, with a slight nod, indicated for Rachel to present her rebuttal. She stood, took a deep breath, and addressed the jury. "Let me be clear," she began, her tone firm but carrying a trace of unease. "What Mr. Harris has proposed is an idealistic view that ignores the very real consequences of the defendant's actions. It doesn't matter what led to the altercation, or how we feel about the broader societal issues at play. This trial is about the facts and whether the law was broken. The evidence is clear." But even as she spoke, Rachel's words seemed to lack their usual conviction. Ethan's perspective had shaken something within the room, a shift in focus that she couldn't quite shake. Yes, there are larger issues, she continued, attempting to regain her footing, but we cannot allow abstract discussions to cloud our judgment. We are not here to engage in a societal debate. We are here to deliver justice based on what happened on that day, not the underlying dynamics that led to the incident. The audience in the courtroom shifted in their seats. The jury exchanged glances, clearly still reflecting on Ethan's argument. Ethan, sitting at the defense table, looked more composed than ever. It was as if he knew exactly what was coming next. The judge, sensing the growing tension, leaned forward. I would remind both parties to focus on the facts before us. We are here to reach a verdict based on the events as they occurred. With that, he turned his attention to Ethan. Mr. Harris, you've certainly introduced a complex line of thought. But this court needs to address the immediate circumstances of the case. What can you say about the defendant's direct involvement? Ethan stood, his face calm and focused, as he prepared to respond. He had expected this moment, knowing full well that the judge was reminding him to stay grounded in the case at hand. But Ethan had a plan, he wasn't about to let his argument get lost in the noise. Your Honor, I fully understand the need to focus on the facts, Ethan began. But we can't ignore the reality that the environment in which these actions occurred is just as important as the actions themselves. The problem isn't just about the behavior of the individuals involved, it's about the broader system that shaped those behaviors. There was a noticeable shift in the room, and even the prosecution seemed less sure. Ethan was making an undeniable point. And now, his strategy was clear, he was making them see the case not just in terms of individual guilt, but in the larger context of human interaction and societal influence. The incident, Ethan continued, was not an isolated event. It was influenced by a pattern of misunderstanding and mistrust that's been building for years. The actions that took place that day were a result of an environment that pushed people to react in ways that weren't necessarily natural, but were shaped by years of division and conflict. Rachel Michaels clenched her jaw. This wasn't the kind of argument she had been prepared for. And yet, she couldn't outright dismiss it. The jury was leaning forward, their attention rapt. Ethan, noticing this, pressed on. But, Your Honor, what's crucial now isn't about punishing someone for a breakdown in judgment. It's about addressing why we've allowed ourselves to get to this point. If we only focus on the consequences of a single moment, we will miss the opportunity to change the system that allowed that moment to occur in the first place. It was as if time had slowed. Every eye in the courtroom was on Ethan. His words had reached a place that few in the room were prepared for. The typical court rules and procedures were still in place, but the focus had shifted. No one was just thinking about guilt or innocence anymore, they were thinking about the bigger picture. Even the defense attorney, Thomas Carter, looked at Ethan with new respect. Ethan's brilliance lay in the simplicity of his argument. He wasn't trying to excuse anything, he was trying to solve the problem. The judge's expression softened. You are making a very compelling case, Mr. Harris. But the jury will have to consider the evidence at hand, and we must not lose sight of the legal specifics in this matter. Ethan nodded. I understand, Your Honor. I'm not asking for a free pass. What I'm asking for is an understanding of the forces that shape our decisions, and the courage to address them. The courtroom was silent. Ethan had just presented a perspective so profound that it transcended the typical confines of the legal system. The case, which had initially seemed like just another routine trial, had transformed into something much larger, a reflection of the societal divides and complex influences that shaped the lives of everyone involved. As the day ended and the jury was dismissed for deliberation, no one knew exactly how the case would unfold. But one thing was certain, Ethan Harris had forever changed the way this trial, and perhaps many others, would be viewed. The tide had shifted, and the courtroom was left grappling with a question that couldn't be easily answered: how do we move forward when we see the law not just as a set of rules, but as a reflection of the world we live in? The deliberation process had taken longer than anyone expected. The jury, deeply divided, had spent hours mulling over the case, and while some jurors found themselves swayed by Ethan's argument, others still clung to the belief that the law should be applied strictly, without regard for the broader societal issues that had been raised. Ethan sat nervously in the courtroom, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His defense attorney, Thomas Carter, remained beside him, occasionally glancing at the door that led to the jury room, his face an unreadable mask. The prosecution, too, seemed tense, though Rachel Michaels kept her composure, her eyes focused ahead, betraying none of the uncertainty that had lingered in the back of her mind ever since Ethan's closing argument. As the clock ticked on, the judge, looking weary but focused, finally called the court to attention. The jury had returned, and it was time for the verdict to be read. The room went completely still as the foreperson of the jury stood, holding the slip of paper that would determine the fate of the accused. The anticipation was palpable, the weight of Ethan's words still hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The foreperson cleared their throat, and the judge leaned forward, ready to hear the decision. "We, the jury, have reached a verdict," the foreperson announced, their voice steady but with a noticeable hesitation. "In the case of the state versus James Carter, we find the defendant, not guilty." A collective breath was drawn in the room, followed by stunned silence. Ethan blinked, his heart racing. He had prepared himself for any outcome, but hearing those words, "not guilty," was something he hadn't fully anticipated. It was as if time had stopped for a moment, the full weight of the verdict sinking in slowly. The prosecution, visibly shocked, stood frozen for a few seconds before Rachel Michaels composed herself and nodded curtly, though her face betrayed a mixture of disbelief and frustration. On the other side, Ethan's defense attorney, Thomas Carter, let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. He gave Ethan a brief smile, though his expression was still serious. They both knew that this case wasn't just about the trial, it had become a moment of reckoning for the legal system itself. As the courtroom erupted into murmurs, the judge banged his gavel and called for order. "This trial is now concluded. The defendant is free to go." The room buzzed with noise, but Ethan barely heard it. His mind was racing. He had won, but the real victory was something deeper than the verdict. It was the acknowledgement that his words had made a difference, that in a world dominated by established norms, he had been able to shift the focus towards something far more important than just the facts of the case. As the courtroom slowly emptied, people gathered their things and filed out. Some spoke in hushed tones about the trial and its unexpected twist, while others quietly pondered the deeper implications of what had transpired. Ethan remained seated for a moment, the reality of his victory still sinking in. "You did it," Thomas Carter said, his voice warm as he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You changed the way they think. You've got something special, kid. You've got a future in law, if that's what you want." Ethan nodded, a faint smile on his face. "I'm just glad it worked," he said, his voice full of quiet humility. "I never wanted to be famous or win some big case, I just wanted to make people see things differently. If we keep looking at everything from the same angle, we'll never fix what's wrong." As they left the courthouse, the media were already waiting outside. Cameras flashed as reporters swarmed toward them, but Ethan, suddenly aware of the magnitude of the moment, felt a strange sense of calm. "Mr. Harris," one reporter called, pushing forward, "how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think this case will change how future trials are approached?" Ethan smiled, the exhaustion of the past few days hitting him. "It's not about me or this case," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's about all of us, and whether we can learn from what happened. The law isn't just about enforcing rules, it's about understanding people and the world they live in." As the reporters jotted down his words, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace. The trial was over, but the conversation was just beginning. The verdict had stunned the court, and Ethan had proven that even the most unlikely of voices could spark change. And while he wasn't sure where his journey would take him next, one thing was certain, he had just taken the first step towards something much larger than he ever imagined. For Ethan Harris, the teenager who stunned the court with a brilliant legal take that no one saw coming, the real work had only just begun. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind. Ethan's name became known across the country, not for the typical reasons one might expect after a trial, but because of his radical, yet undeniably insightful, approach to the legal system. What had started as a local case quickly turned into a national conversation about justice, social issues, and the responsibility of the legal system to address more than just individual actions. Ethan was interviewed by news outlets, invited to podcasts, and even received messages from law schools eager to speak with him. People were intrigued by his unexpected maturity and his ability to frame a conversation that went beyond guilt or innocence. His ideas sparked debates everywhere, from online forums to college campuses to dinner tables across the nation. But despite the newfound attention, Ethan remained grounded. He wasn't seeking fame, nor was he interested in using the trial to launch his career. He was driven by a deeper purpose, to make people reconsider how they viewed justice. He knew the issues he'd raised in court were larger than the case itself, and he wanted to see how they could be addressed. A few weeks after the trial, Ethan was invited to speak at a national forum on criminal justice reform. As he stood before an audience of activists, politicians, and legal scholars, Ethan felt the weight of the opportunity. This was no longer about one case, it was about a larger movement that was beginning to take shape. People were listening. And they were starting to change their perspective. Justice is more than the sum of its parts, Ethan said, his voice steady. It's not just about deciding who's guilty and who's innocent. It's about understanding how we got to this point, how we all contribute to the environment in which these actions occur. The system is broken, and until we acknowledge that, we'll never truly have justice. The audience was silent for a moment before a round of applause began. People in the room had heard many speeches about reform, but few had put it in such simple, yet profound terms. Ethan wasn't trying to change the law overnight, he was trying to change the way people thought about it. Back at home, Ethan's life had changed in ways he hadn't fully expected. Friends treated him differently, not out of admiration, but because they now saw him as someone with a weighty responsibility. His parents, though proud, were concerned about the future. Ethan was just a teenager, how could he possibly carry the weight of such an important conversation? But Ethan didn't see it as a burden. He saw it as an opportunity, a chance to shape the kind of world he wanted to live in. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he felt more determined than ever. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected call came. It was from the office of the district attorney, Rachel Michaels, the same prosecutor who had once stood across from him in court. "Ethan," she said, her voice cautious, "I wanted to speak with you. Not about the case, but about your ideas. You've sparked something, and I think it's time we start having a real conversation about change. Would you be open to meeting with me?" Ethan was taken aback. Rachel Michaels, the prosecutor who had been so fierce in her stance during the trial, now wanted to meet with him to discuss reform. It was an offer he hadn't expected, but one that felt important. "Of course," Ethan replied, his curiosity piqued. "I'd like that." A week later, they met at a quiet cafe in the city. Rachel, no longer the hardened prosecutor, was wearing a more relaxed expression. She had come to respect Ethan's ability to think outside the box, something rare in a profession built on precedent. "Listen," she said, after a few pleasantries, "I won't pretend I agree with everything you said in court. But I can't ignore the fact that you made me rethink things. We're both in the same system, and it's clear that something needs to change. So, I wanted to talk to you about how we could make that happen, how we could work together to push for real reform, not just for the people in the courtroom, but for everyone who's impacted by the system." Ethan smiled, surprised by her candidness. He had expected resistance, but here she was, openly acknowledging the need for change. "I'd be honored to work with you," he said. "We've got a long way to go, but if we can start talking about the real issues, maybe we can make a difference." The two of them continued their conversation for hours, discussing everything from sentencing reform to how racial and social disparities could be addressed within the justice system. They even talked about ways to incorporate Ethan's vision into school curricula, inspiring young people to think critically about justice from an early age. By the end of their meeting, Ethan had a newfound sense of hope. This wasn't just some fleeting moment, it was the beginning of something that could grow and evolve. And it wasn't just about him anymore. He had opened a door, and now people who had been previously divided by the system were coming together, ready to challenge the status quo. As Ethan left the cafe that day, he realized something profound: the case he had been involved in wasn't just a one-time fluke. It was a catalyst for change. His victory had sparked a conversation, one that would ripple across the legal system, challenging people to look beyond individual guilt and to consider the deeper forces at play in society. He wasn't just a teenager anymore. He was a symbol of what was possible when people dared to think differently. And though the journey was far from over, Ethan knew one thing for sure: the legal world had been forever altered by the brilliance of an idea that no one had seen coming. And it was only just beginning. Months passed, but the momentum Ethan had sparked continued to grow. His name was now synonymous with fresh perspectives on justice, and people from all walks of life were seeking him out. He was invited to speak at universities, legal conferences, and even appeared as a guest on national television. But with each new opportunity, Ethan remained committed to his core belief, that real change wasn't about individual recognition, but about transforming the way society understood and approached justice. One evening, as he sat at home, reviewing notes for his next speaking engagement, a message popped up on his phone. It was from Thomas Carter, his defense attorney from the trial. "Ethan, I've been thinking a lot about what you said in court, and what's happened since. I think it's time to take this further. We have the chance to work with a coalition of advocates to push for some real policy changes. Would you be interested?" Ethan hesitated for only a moment before responding. "Absolutely. Let's do it." A week later, Ethan found himself in a small conference room surrounded by lawyers, social justice advocates, and even former judges. The group had come together to discuss how to reform the criminal justice system, with Ethan's perspective at the center. They were working to draft a new initiative, a set of policies that would focus not just on punitive measures, but on restorative justice, education, and the rehabilitation of communities as a whole. "Ethan," Thomas began, addressing the group, "you've already shifted the conversation with your thoughts on justice. Now, we need to take it a step further. The question is, how do we turn those ideas into action?" Ethan felt the weight of the room on him, all eyes waiting for his answer. He had always been an idealist, but now the stakes were higher than ever. This was his chance to help make the changes he'd been advocating for. He stood up, his voice steady but filled with passion. "It starts with understanding," he said. "We've spent too long treating the system like it's a machine, where people are either guilty or innocent. What we forget is that the system should be about addressing the underlying causes of crime, poverty, lack of education, systemic inequality, and finding ways to prevent these issues from spiraling in the first place." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It's not just about punishing people. It's about creating opportunities for healing and education, for people to rebuild their lives. If we keep looking at the problem through the lens of blame and retribution, we'll never fix what's really broken." The room was silent, but there was a sense of collective agreement in the air. These were seasoned professionals who had spent years in the system, but Ethan had presented them with a new lens, a lens through which they could see the flaws in their approach. One of the former judges in the room, Judge William Andrews, spoke up. "What you're talking about is a paradigm shift. And it's not just about the courts, it's about education, housing, mental health services. We need to create a system where rehabilitation isn't just an afterthought, but a primary goal." The conversation shifted from abstract ideals to concrete actions. They began discussing ways to introduce restorative justice practices into schools, how to improve mental health resources for those incarcerated, and how to engage communities in the rehabilitation process. They also talked about reducing the harshness of sentences for nonviolent offenders and creating more opportunities for second chances. As the meeting came to a close, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. This wasn't just about legal reform, it was about creating a future where everyone had a chance to succeed, not just those who had the privilege of a fair system. It was about acknowledging that no one's life could be reduced to a single mistake or misstep. The next few months were a blur of research, meetings, and lobbying. Ethan's initiative gained traction, with several high-profile legal organizations offering their support. Eventually, they were able to secure a meeting with lawmakers in Washington, D.C., to present their proposed reforms. Ethan, along with Thomas and the coalition of advocates, sat before a panel of senators and congresspeople. The air in the room was tense, but Ethan remained calm, the weight of his words carrying more significance than ever before. "We're asking for a shift in how we think about crime and punishment," Ethan said, his voice clear. "We're asking for a system that doesn't just punish people for their mistakes, but also offers them the opportunity to rebuild and reintegrate into society." One of the senators, a staunch advocate for criminal justice reform, leaned forward. "This is the kind of thinking we need. We've seen how punitive measures alone don't work. We need a new approach, one that's more focused on rehabilitation." Ethan smiled, knowing that this was the beginning of something much larger than any one individual. His voice, once that of a teenager speaking out in court, had now become part of a national conversation about justice and reform. Months later, their proposed policies gained traction in the Senate. Slowly but surely, the laws began to change, moving toward a more restorative and rehabilitative approach. It was a slow, uphill battle, but Ethan never stopped pushing forward. He continued to speak at conferences, engage in discussions, and write about his experiences, all while advocating for the changes he knew were needed. And as the movement gained momentum, he couldn't help but think back to that moment in the courtroom, when he had stood up against the expectations and offered a take that no one saw coming. He had never set out to be a leader of a movement, but it was clear now that his voice had sparked something bigger than he could have ever imagined. The journey was far from over, but Ethan Harris knew one thing for sure: the conversation about justice was just beginning, and he would continue to be at the forefront, pushing for change, one step at a time. Years had passed since the day Ethan Harris first stood before the court, challenging the very fabric of the legal system with an argument that no one had anticipated. What began as a teenager's quest for understanding had blossomed into a full-fledged movement for criminal justice reform. The changes Ethan had helped spark were not just about altering laws, they were about changing mindsets, reshaping institutions, and, most importantly, shifting the way society viewed justice itself. Ethan was no longer just the teenager who had stunned a courtroom. He had grown into a prominent advocate for justice reform. The policies that his coalition had worked tirelessly to create had now been implemented across several states, and the federal government was beginning to take notice. Restorative justice had started to take root, especially in schools, prisons, and local communities, where rehabilitation programs had begun to replace harsh sentencing measures for nonviolent offenses. But it wasn't just the legal system that had changed, it was the people. Conversations about justice had become a regular part of the national dialogue. People from all walks of life, once unfamiliar with the nuances of criminal justice, were now engaging in discussions about fairness, rehabilitation, and the importance of understanding the causes of crime rather than focusing solely on punishment. One afternoon, as Ethan sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of policy papers, a familiar voice came through the phone. It was Thomas Carter, the defense attorney who had been by his side through the trial and the reforms that followed. "Ethan," Thomas said, his voice brimming with pride, "you've done it. We've done it. The new bill is passing today in the Senate, and it's everything we've been fighting for. Restorative justice is no longer just an idea, it's a reality." Ethan smiled, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. It wasn't just the legal victory that mattered, it was the realization that real change had been achieved. What started as a single voice in a courtroom had evolved into a movement that was transforming lives across the nation. But the journey hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, bitter opposition from those who clung to traditional punitive measures, heated debates in legislative halls, and countless hours spent working behind the scenes to gain support. Yet through it all, Ethan never wavered from his belief that justice was about understanding, healing, and second chances. The victory in the Senate was a culmination of years of effort, but Ethan knew the work wasn't over. Laws had been changed, but true transformation took time, and the work of shifting societal perceptions about justice, fairness, and opportunity would continue long after he was gone. As the years went by, Ethan began to take on new roles. He was offered teaching positions at law schools, where he shared his ideas on justice with the next generation of lawyers. He traveled the world, speaking at international forums, where his insights into restorative justice began to influence legal systems in other countries. And he remained a tireless advocate, always pushing for a more compassionate, equitable system. One evening, years after that life-changing trial, Ethan stood in a crowded auditorium at a major criminal justice summit, his name flashing across the screen. The room was filled with people who had been impacted by his work, advocates, lawmakers, reformers, and even former inmates who had benefited from restorative programs. Ethan took the stage, his voice steady, but now with a maturity that came from years of hard-fought victories. This movement was never about me. It's about all of us. It's about understanding that justice isn't just about holding people accountable, it's about giving people the tools to rebuild their lives, to heal, and to make our communities stronger. The laws can change, but real justice is something we have to work for every single day. The audience erupted into applause, and as Ethan looked out at the crowd, he felt a deep sense of peace. His journey had been far from what he had expected, but in every way that mattered, he had succeeded. Not because he had sought fame or recognition, but because he had dared to ask the tough questions and had fought for something better. In the end, Ethan Harris had not only stunned a court with a brilliant legal take, but he had stunned the world with his vision of justice, a vision that was, in every sense of the word, transformative. And as the applause echoed in the hall, he knew this was just the beginning of a legacy that would continue to inspire change for generations to come. The story of Ethan Harris, the teenager who had reshaped the criminal justice system, had come full circle, but his impact would echo on forever.